In 1914, a young man named Paul von Hindenburg watched confidently as the German Empire prepared for war. War had been coming for a while. For years, European nations had been rattling sabers, building armies, competing in an increasingly hostile environment. It was almost inevitable that sooner or later, someone would push things too far. So, when Austria, backed by Germany, declared war on Serbia following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, von Hindenburg felt sure that it wouldn't last long. He even predicted what would happen, that after a few quick victories against the Serbs, the Austrians would be able to negotiate peace from a position of strength. Unfortunately for Paul and the rest of the world, he had no idea what he was talking about. When World War I began, most people, including many politicians and generals, expected it to be a short affair. Europe would be locked in deadly combat, but decisive battles would be few and far between. Instead, the war quickly degenerated into a stalemate. The French and British were soon bogged down in a bloody stalemate on the Western Front, while the Russians struggled to make any headway against the Austro-Hungarians in the east. Soon, the fighting would become static as trench warfare took hold. Troops would be stuck in place for months on end, unable to make any progress. And it wasn't just on the battlefield that the war became protracted. The belligerents soon realized that winning would require more than just military might. They'd need to sustain their armies for the long haul, which meant that the war would become a test of economic and industrial capacity. And here, the Germans had a huge advantage. Not only did they have a large population and economy, but thanks to decades of preparation, their military was extremely well funded. When war broke out, the German General Staff had already prepared detailed plans for the conflict, something that would allow them to rapidly mobilize their resources once hostilities began. Meanwhile, the French and British would struggle to coordinate their efforts, hindered by entrenched political rivalries. Eventually, the British, French, Americans, and their allies would match the Germans economically, supplying their troops with everything they needed to fight for years on end. But this would take time, and in the meantime, the death toll mounted. At first, the casualties of World War I were relatively light. But as the war dragged on, battles grew longer and more destructive. Whole divisions could now be wiped out in a single day. Entire cities could be reduced to rubble. And as the conflict entered its fourth year, the death toll began to mount. It soon became clear that the war would not end anytime soon. After all, World War I was largely a conflict between rich, industrialized nations. Most people had little understanding of the complex web of alliances and obligations that had brought their countries into the war. They simply knew that they were fighting, and they wanted to know why. In Germany, Paul von Hindenburg tried to answer that question. In 1916, he wrote a book called The General Staff and the War, in which he argued that Germany was fighting a defensive war against hostile neighbors. It was a noble cause, he said, and the German people should rally behind their soldiers and support them unconditionally. Meanwhile, in Britain, Prime Minister David Lloyd George tried a different tack. He emphasized the high ideals of the conflict, arguing that the British were fighting to defend democracy and liberty against tyranny and oppression. These appeals fell on deaf ears. By 1917, the German and British people were exhausted. They'd suffered enormous losses and seen little to show for it. At the same time, new technologies were entering the battlefield, changing the way wars were fought. Planes began dropping bombs on cities. Tanks rumbled across no man's land, and poison gas choked the life out of entire divisions. As the war dragged on, it became clear that the old rules no longer applied. The future of warfare was here, and it was brutal. As the war dragged on, the belligerents began to look for ways to break the stalemate. The French and British tried the naval offensive, a massive attack on the Western Front that ended in disaster. The Germans responded with their own attacks, but these also failed. Soon, the Western Front would be locked in another stalemate. But in the East, things were very different. There, the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, was determined to win a decisive victory. He ordered his generals to launch a massive attack on the Austrians. At first, things went well. The Russians pushed deep into enemy territory and captured the city of Karansebes. But then the Germans arrived. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Russians were forced to retreat. The Germans pursued them, driving them back to the Niemen River. The Russians were in full retreat. But then something remarkable happened. The Germans stopped. They had the Russians on the run, and they could have chased them all the way home. But instead, they called off the attack and retreated to their own lines. Why? Because they had made a terrible mistake. In their pursuit of the Russians, they had pushed too far and were now dangerously exposed. If the Russians could regroup, they could be in serious trouble. So they called off the attack and retreated. It was a sound decision, but it enraged the German people. After 4 years of war, they were tired of stalemate. And now, their army had actually retreated in the face of the enemy. They demanded that the generals go forward and finish the job. But the generals knew better. They had seen how close they had come to disaster and were in no mood to take risks. So they refused. This was the low point for the Germans. They had lost faith in their army, and the war seemed hopeless. But then something happened that turned everything around. The Germans launched one final massive attack on the Western Front. It caught the Allies by surprise and swept them back. For the first time in years, the Germans were on the offensive, and the Allies were on the defensive. Paul von Hindenburg basked in the glory, but it was short-lived. The Allies regrouped and launched a counterattack that drove the Germans back to the Western Front. The fighting continued like this until finally, in November 1918, the Germans collapsed. Over the next few weeks, they sued for peace and retreated behind their borders. World War I was over. For the Germans, the war had been a disaster. They had lost millions of men and much of their territory. And now they faced the difficult task of rebuilding their country. But despite their losses, they had emerged from the war with their heads held high. They had fought bravely and honorably, and that was something to be proud of. That is, except for one small detail. They had lost the war, and no amount of national pride could change that. Over the next few years, the Germans would come to terms with their defeat and begin the long process of rebuilding their country. But for many of them, the war would never be over. They would spend the rest of their lives haunted by the memories of the trenches, the fear of battle, the smell of death. Those memories would stay with them until the day they died. One of those men was Paul von Hindenburg. He survived the war and went on to play an important role in the Weimar Republic. But he never forgot the lessons of World War I. He knew that the war had been a catastrophe for Germany, and he was determined to prevent it from happening again. In 1934, he would help bring Adolf Hitler to power in the hopes that the new chancellor could restore German greatness. Unfortunately for him, he had no idea what he was getting himself into. What do you think? Was World War I a turning point in history? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want to see more videos like this.